The first sound I remember is laughter, the wrong kind of laughter. Not the warm, honeyed kind that fills a wedding hall, but the sharp, metallic sound people make when they don't know what else to do. It sliced through the room a second after my father announced into the microphone, "This boy is an idiot, but my daughter insisted on marrying him anyway." People laughed. They actually laughed. And in that frozen second, while my husband's face drained of color and my own hands began to tremble, I realized something terrifying. The man who had shaped my childhood was about to shape the rest of my life unless I stopped him. My legs felt weak, but something inside me, something I didn't know still existed, rose like a wave. I pushed my chair back. The scraping sound cut the laughter clean in half. Everyone turned to look at me, but I only saw one face, my father's. Smug. Certain of his power. Certain I would stay silent like I always had. He had no idea what I was about to do. He had no idea this time I wouldn't let him be the loudest voice in the room. People say your wedding day should be a beginning, not an ending. But for me, it was both. It was the beginning of my marriage and the end of my fear. The hall we'd rented in the middle of Beaufort, South Carolina wasn't glamorous, but it was warm and familiar. Strings of soft lights hung from the beams, catching reflections in the glasses of sweet tea and champagne. The scent of roasted chicken and cornbread drifted from the buffet line. My mother had chosen cream-colored linens because she said white was too cold for Southern hearts, and the DJ, a retired Coast Guard officer, played gentle Motown as people drifted to their seats. Everything looked like the start of a peaceful life, until the moment my father stood up and claimed the spotlight. But before I tell you what happened after I pushed my chair back, before I show you the path that led me to the microphone, I need to take you back to the hours before the wedding. Because nothing that happened in that room made sense unless you understood the years leading up to it and the storm that gathered the night before. I woke up early on my wedding day, long before the sun rose. The house where my family was staying for the weekend, an old marshfront rental with creaky floors, and the faint scent of pine felt too quiet for how many relatives were inside it. My mother was already awake brewing coffee, her shoulders tense. My sister Hannah sat at the table cutting strawberries, the knife tapping against the bowl. Neither of them asked how I had slept, and I didn't ask them either, because we all knew the answer. I kept replaying my father's words from the night before. "You still have time to cancel this wedding." He had said it like a warning, like he was doing me a favor. He stood in the narrow hallway beside the rows of childhood photographs, me in my Coast Guard uniform, Hannah at her high school graduation, my parents on their 25th anniversary, and looked at me as if I were an enemy he was trying to outmaneuver. "Love won't fix, stupid," he'd muttered. "And that man you're marrying is soft, weak. He'll drag you down." It wasn't new. My father had always spoken like that, but the cruelty of the message and the timing 24 hours before I said I do hit me in a place I didn't know was still vulnerable. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face, the certainty in his jaw, the dismissiveness in his tone. A lifetime of his opinions trying to overwrite my own. But when the sunlight finally broke through the blinds and danced across the hardwood floor, I made myself breathe. Deeply. Slowly. I told myself this was my day. Mine and Evan's. Not my father's. Evan texted me just as I poured a cup of coffee. "Good morning, beautiful. Whatever happens today, we'll face it together." He wasn't a man of grand speeches. He didn't need to be. His steadiness was the kind I had learned to lean on without even realizing it, and right then that text felt like a rope pulling me back to solid ground. My mother tried to smile as I sat down beside her. "Big day," she whispered, but her eyes didn't match her tone. They were red-rimmed, tired. "Has he said anything this morning?" I asked. She shook her head. "Your father went for a drive. He said he needed space to think." That could mean anything. My father's thinking had a way of becoming everyone else's problem. Relatives began shuffling through the kitchen, my aunt from Tennessee, cousins from Atlanta, my grandmother's sister who had flown from Kentucky and wasn't pleased to see the tension in the house. People hugged me, told me I looked radiant, asked if I was nervous. I kept smiling, but beneath it was a tightness in my chest, a pressure like someone holding a palm against my sternum. I dressed silently in the little guest room upstairs. My dress wasn't extravagant, just a simple ivory gown with lace at the sleeves, but when I slipped it on, I felt a softness settle around me. A reminder that I was allowed to feel joy no matter what my father believed about strength or weakness. Hannah came in without knocking, carrying a pair of earrings. "These were Grandma's," she said softly. "She'd want you to wear them." I saw something fragile in her expression, worry mixed with pride. "I'm sorry he talked to you like that last night," she added, eyes fixed on the earrings. "It's not your fault," I whispered. "No," she said. "But it shouldn't have been yours either." She hugged me then, and I held her so tightly my fingers trembled. My sister, the one who used to hide behind me during thunderstorms, was now offering me comfort I didn't know I needed. The ceremony itself was beautiful. We exchanged vows under an arch my mother had decorated with magnolia branches. Evan's hand was warm in mine, his voice steady, as he promised to love me with patience and honesty. When I looked at him, I didn't see doubt. I saw a man who had chosen me without hesitation, without fear. My father didn't meet my gaze during the ceremony. He kept his eyes fixed somewhere past us, jaw-tight, arms crossed. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, he clapped once sharp solitary, and then stopped as if he'd fulfilled an obligation but refused to feel anything about it. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself he couldn't ruin this. I told myself his silence was easier than his fury. I told myself a lot of things that would turn out to be wrong. The reception hall glowed with soft light as people filed in. The DJ played our first dance song, guests took their seats, and plates of steaming food were carried out. Evan and I greeted table after table, smiling until our cheeks hurt. For a brief stretch of time, I let myself relax. My father stayed near the back of the room, speaking quietly to two of his brothers, glancing my way only once. Then the DJ walked toward the stage, tapping the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin the toasts." But before he could finish, my father stood. The movement itself felt violent, like something ripping through a calm surface. "I'd like to say something," he announced. He didn't wait for permission. He stepped onto the small platform, reached for the microphone, and gave the DJ a firm nod that meant move. The DJ stepped aside. I froze. I knew that posture, that tone, that look in his eyes. Evan squeezed my hand under the table, but I barely felt it. My father tapped the microphone twice. "Testing," he said, and the sound echoed through the hall. Guests quieted. Chairs shifted. Silverware stopped clinking. He looked directly at Evan, then smirked. "This boy," he said slowly, "is an idiot. But my daughter insisted on marrying him anyway." The words didn't feel real at first. They felt like something pulled from a nightmare, one of those dreams where your voice gets stuck in your throat and you can't move, no matter how hard you try. Then the laughter came. Not loud, not joyful, awkward, nervous. People laughed because they thought they were supposed to, or because they didn't know him, or because they didn't know me. But I knew. And when I turned to Evan, I saw the color drain from his face so fast it felt like watching someone lose air underwater. His eyes dropped to the table, his hand tightened around the napkin. A tremor moved down his jaw. My father laughed at his own line, soaking in the attention. Something broke in me. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, cleanly. Like a thread that had been pulled too tight for too long. I felt my chest rise, my pulse hammering against my ribs, my breath come in sharp, controlled bursts. Years of Coast Guard training told me to stay composed. Years of being his daughter told me to stay silent. But something older than fear woke up inside me. I pushed my chair back. The sound cut through the room like a blade. Conversations died instantly. Heads turned. My father looked amused, as if he believed he had won whatever twisted game he thought he was playing. I stood. My legs trembled, but they held. And without saying a word, I began walking toward the microphone. Every step tightened the air in the room. Every step peeled back a layer of the girl he raised. I didn't look at Evan. I didn't look at my mother. I didn't look at the guests who now stared at me with wide, uncertain eyes. I looked at only one person. The man who taught me to fear silence more than shouting. The man who believed volume made him right. The man who thought humiliation was a form of leadership. My father. When I reached the stage, the DJ extended his hand to claim the microphone back from my father, but I stepped between them. "I'll take it," I said. My father blinked. A crack of uncertainty flickered across his face. For the first time in my life, he didn't know what I was going to do next, and in that moment, standing under the warm lights of a hall filled with people who had witnessed both my joy and my humiliation, I understood something I had never understood before. Fear doesn't disappear. You just stop letting it choose your actions. I lifted the microphone, turned toward the room, and felt a stillness settle around me, deep and ancient, like standing in the eye of a storm. "My father," I said softly, "has embarrassed me my whole life. But tonight, he crossed a line. You could have heard a pin drop. And that's where everything truly began." When I said those first words into the microphone, the room froze. But the truth is, the fear that pushed those words out of me didn't begin at that wedding. It didn't begin with Evan. It didn't begin with any moment you could point to on a calendar. It began years earlier in a little house shaded by live oaks at the edge of Savannah, where my father's voice filled every corner long before I learned how to speak back. I grew up in a neighborhood where kids rode their bikes without helmets, and neighbors shouted hello across driveways. Mama hung laundry on the clothesline behind the house, and Hannah and I chased lightning bugs in the early evenings. It looked peaceful from the outside. Most people thought it was. People love the illusion of a simple Southern family where the father works hard, the mother cooks, and the children behave. They see what they want to see. Inside our house, though, there was another truth. A truth that lived in the tone of my father's footsteps, in the way Mama flinched when a cabinet door slammed. In the silence I learned to sit in so I wouldn't draw attention to myself. Fear wasn't a single moment. It was a climate. My father had a rule for everything. Shoes lined up perfectly by the door, no loud voices at dinner, no talking back, and absolutely no crying. Tears were weakness. Emotion was drama. Mistakes were punishable. He didn't just want a quiet house. He wanted a controlled house where he was the axis everyone else orbited around. Some of my earliest memories are of listening for the creak of the hallway floorboards. When I heard them, I'd straighten my posture lower, my voice make myself smaller. When Hannah and I fought over toys like normal sisters, he didn't separate us gently. He'd bark, "Stop that nonsense before I give you something real to cry about." That sentence still echoes in me sometimes. Mama would smooth things over later, telling us he just had a hard day or didn't mean it like that. She believed softness could soothe any wound. But softness without boundaries is just silence wearing a dress, and silence doesn't save children. It only teaches them how to survive. I was 10 the first time I realized my father's pride mattered more to him than my feelings. It was Thanksgiving, and Mama had spent the whole morning basting the turkey and arranging the table. She asked me to fold the napkins into little fans, and I worked so hard to get each crease perfect. When Daddy walked in, I looked up at him, waiting for his approval like it was air I needed to breathe. He scanned the table, frowned, and said, "You folded these wrong." Then he swept his hand across the table and sent the napkins fluttering to the floor. Mama flinched. I froze. Hannah stared. Daddy didn't pick them up. He didn't help. He just sat down in his chair and waited for us to correct the mistake. I remember kneeling on the tile floor, refolding each napkin while my face burned. He talked to Mama about football as if nothing had happened, as if knocking the breath out of a child didn't matter. That was the first moment I felt humiliation settle like dust in my lungs. But Daddy didn't see it as cruelty. He saw it as teaching. He always believed he was teaching us something. When I turned 12, I started softball. I loved running bases, the way the dirt kicked up around my cleats, the way I could feel strong without anyone else's permission. Daddy showed up to my first game, leaned against the chain-link fence, and watched me with an expression I couldn't read. When I scored a run, I ran toward him for approval. All he said was, "You should have slid. You're too careful." There was always a should have. Always a standard just beyond reach. Always a way to be better, but never a way to be enough. By the time I was in high school, I knew exactly who I was allowed to be around him. Small, agreeable, useful, never too emotional, never too bold. Anytime I expressed an opinion he didn't like, he'd say, "Don't get smart with me," as if my thoughts were weapons aimed at him. Hannah learned to disappear, blending into the background in a way I envied. She had a gentler spirit, and he rarely singled her out. But Mama and we carried more of the impact. Mama because she loved him. Me because I challenged him simply by wanting something different. When I told him I wanted to join the Coast Guard, he laughed. A deep, mocking laugh that echoed in my memory long after the moment passed. "You won't last a month," he said. "You're too emotional. They'll eat you alive." He didn't know that hearing him doubt me felt like fuel. His disbelief burned, but it pushed me forward. When I left home for training, Mama cried, Hannah hugged me tight, and Daddy said, "You'll be back." But I didn't come back. Not right away. Not in the way he expected. And the longer I was gone, the more I saw what life looked like without his voice shaping every thought I had. Coast Guard training was hard, but it was fair. Expectations were high, but they were clear. When I made mistakes, instructors corrected me without humiliating me. When I succeeded, they acknowledged it without tearing it down. It was the first place I learned that authority didn't have to roar to be respected, that strength could be calm, that leadership could be earned. I felt something inside me rebuilding slowly, painfully, but surely. Yet every time I returned home on leave, Daddy treated my service like a hobby. He'd introduce me to people by saying, "This is my daughter who ran off to play soldier," as if my deployment was nothing more than a passing phase. Sometimes his comments made me angry. Sometimes they made me laugh. But mostly, they made me tired. Exhaustion is a special kind of grief. One afternoon during a rare quiet moment with Mama, she told me he had been bragging to neighbors that he taught me everything I knew about discipline. The irony almost choked me. Mama saw the disbelief on my face and said softly, "He doesn't understand how to give credit. He only understands how to take it." Hannah, who had grown bolder with age, told me that Daddy talked to her the way he used to talk to me. Not as harshly, but with the same impatience, the same need to correct, the same inability to listen. "It's like he thinks he knows us better than we know ourselves," she said. I realized then that none of us had ever been truly seen by him. We were reflections of what he believed a family should look like, not who we actually were. He expected obedience, not connection. I remember visiting home during a stormy December. Rain hammered the windows and the fireplace crackled weakly. I sat at the kitchen table writing a letter to a friend from the service when Daddy walked in, saw the pen in my hand and said, "Shouldn't you be doing something useful?" The question wasn't genuine. It was a jab meant to remind me that my time only mattered when it served him. Mama turned from the stove and said, "She's just writing a letter." "That's what I mean," he said, always in her feelings. I didn't look up. I didn't defend myself. I'd learned there's no winning a debate with a man who only listens to the sound of his own voice. But that night, lying in my childhood bedroom with the rain tapping softly at the window, I realized something. His voice had followed me across states, across deployments, across years. Even when I was proud of myself, a part of me still waited for his criticism. A part of me still wanted his approval even when I knew it would never come. You don't outgrow your childhood. You outgrow the silence you were forced to keep. I didn't understand that fully until much later, until the day Evan came into my life, but the seeds were already there. As I got older, my relationship with Daddy became a quiet tug of war. He wanted control. I wanted distance. Mama tried to be the bridge between us, but bridges only hold if both sides have something to anchor to. Daddy had his anger. I had my absence. There wasn't much connecting us beyond genetics and years of swallowed pride. Still, I wanted a father A real one. Not the man he became when he was disappointed or threatened. I wanted to believe he could soften, that he could change that. Somewhere behind the sharp edges was someone who cared enough to try. He didn't, at least not then. On the morning of my wedding, as I stood before the mirror looking at my reflection dressed in ivory lace, I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who flinched at slammed doors, who folded napkins perfectly to avoid criticism, who tried to make herself small enough to slip under the radar of her father's moods. I touched the earrings Hannah had given me and wondered if Daddy ever truly wanted to know me at all. Not the version he talked about proudly to strangers, but the real me, the woman I had become despite him, not because of him. I thought about confronting him that morning. I thought about telling him he couldn't speak to me the way he did the night before. But the truth is, I was tired. Tired of fighting a battle that never ended. Tired of hoping for change that never came. Tired of wanting love from someone who only offered control. So I stayed quiet. Not out of fear, but out of necessity. I didn't want my wedding day to be another memory shaped by his voice. But silence is a fragile shield. And when he picked up that microphone at the reception, when he let the word idiot fall from his lips and land like a blow against the man I loved, something ancient inside me snapped. Not the part of me that feared him, the part of me that remembered everything leading to that moment. Every napkin knocked to the floor, every comment that cut deeper than a belt ever could. Every time I swallowed my voice to keep the peace, every time he mistook obedience for love. By the time I stood up from that table, I wasn't just defending Evan. I was defending the little girl I used to be. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to be louder than the voice that had controlled me for 3 decades. I didn't truly understand what respect felt like until the afternoon I met Evan Brooks. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There were no fireworks, no sweeping music, no sudden realization that my life was about to shift. It was simple and quiet, almost forgettable, except it wasn't. Because sometimes life doesn't change with an explosion. Sometimes it changes with a soft hello. It happened on a breezy Saturday in early spring when I was home on leave. A storm had torn through the marshes the week before, leaving several families without homes, and the community center had organized a relief drive. I'd volunteered partly out of duty, partly out of habit, and partly because being at home under my father's shadow made my skin feel too tight. The gymnasium inside the community center looked like every multi-purpose room in the South, scuffed basketball lines, metal folding chairs stacked against the wall, fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Tables were lined with jackets, diapers, canned goods, blankets, and toiletries. The air smelled like coffee plastic bags, and a faint hint of tomato soup warming in a crock pot. I was carrying a box of donated socks when I saw him. He was stacking cans on a long table in front of him, carefully lining up the labels so they faced forward. Not obsessively, just intentionally, as if even small acts deserved attention. His hair was wind-tousled, his t-shirt faded, and his jeans had that worn look that comes from actual work, not fashion. He didn't notice me at first. He was humming softly an old country tune I recognized from the radio Mama used to play. He wasn't handsome in the loud, obvious way some men try to be. He didn't posture. He didn't check to see if anyone was watching. There was something gentle in the slope of his shoulders, something steady in the way his hands moved. I noticed all of it in the span of 3 seconds, and it lodged itself somewhere deeper than I expected. I set the box down beside him and said, "You building a tower there?" He startled, blinking up at me. Then he smiled a real smile, unguarded, warm. Trying to keep them from collapsing, he said, "Geometry wasn't my strongest subject." I laughed before I even realized I was going to. "Lieutenant in the Coast Guard," I told him. "I've seen worse structures." "Oh," he said, his eyebrows lifting. "So you're the muscle around here." "The brains, too," I replied. His grin widened. Not flirtatious, not bold, just amused. Safe. He held out a hand. "Evan." "Marion," I said, shaking it. We worked side by side for the next hour, sliding boxes into neat rows, packing bags for families who walked through the doors with exhaustion clinging to their faces. Evan spoke softly to everyone, especially the older folks. When a little boy began to cry because the jacket he wanted was too big, Evan knelt beside him, rolled up the sleeves and said, "There. Now it's magic." The boy stopped crying. Something inside me softened. When we took a break, Evan poured 2 cups of coffee into paper cups. "You take sugar?" he asked. "No," I said. He handed me one anyway. "It's just coffee, nothing complicated." It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Men like my father always made simple things feel sharp and dangerous. As a child, asking for a glass of water could become a lecture. In the Coast Guard, things were fair, but rigid. But Evan handed me coffee like it was an offering, not an obligation. We sat on the bleachers watching volunteers file in and out. A draft blew through the cracked door carrying the scent of fresh rain. "What got you into the Coast Guard?" Evan asked. "Escape," I said truthfully before I could stop myself. He didn't look surprised. He didn't ask what I meant. He simply nodded as if he understood there were stories behind my answer that weren't meant for a first conversation. "And you?" I asked. "I build things," he said. "Roads, mostly. Bridges, sometimes. Infrastructure for the county. Important work." He shrugged with a half-smile. "Important enough to keep me employed." "You talk about it like you don't want credit." "I don't need credit," he said. "I just like making things that last." I don't know why, but that sentence slipped under my defenses. Maybe because it was the opposite of my father's philosophy. He controlled things, broke things, rebuilt nothing. As the day went on, Evan and I kept ending up near each other, sorting through stacks of blankets or checking inventory. Every time I looked up, he was there, steady as a heartbeat. When he talked, he met my eyes without trying to dominate the space between us. When he listened, he didn't interrupt. I didn't realize how rare that was until it was in front of me. Later in the afternoon, an older volunteer leaned over and whispered, "He's been here since dawn. Kind soul, that one. Helps everyone but never says much about himself." I pretended not to care about the comment, but it stayed with me like a warm ember in the chest. When the drive finally ended, people filtered out one by one. Evan walked with me to my car. The sun was setting, casting gold across the marsh grass. He kicked lightly at a pebble on the pavement. "It was good working with you," he said. "You too." There was a pause, not uncomfortable but thoughtful. "Would you maybe want to get coffee sometime?" he asked. "The kind that comes in a real mug, not one of those paper ones." A part of me bristled with old fear. My father's voice echoed through my head. "Don't trust kindness. Don't trust softness. Don't trust anyone who shows emotion." But another part, a quieter, braver part, leaned forward. "I'd like that," I said. Evan grinned again, the same warm, easy expression he'd worn all day. "Great. Here, let me give you my number. Unless you want me to take yours." "I can take yours," I said quickly. "I'm better at reaching out than waiting." He laughed. "Fair enough." I saved his number and slid into my car. As I drove away, I realized I was smiling at nothing. A small, surprised smile. The kind that feels like discovering a new room in a house you've lived in all your life. I didn't tell my father about Evan right away. I knew how it would go. Daddy didn't trust men he couldn't measure with outdated standards. He respected loud voices, firm handshakes, and jobs that required sweat and steel. Evan was quiet, thoughtful. A civil engineer who built bridges instead of breaking them. Someone like my father didn't understand someone like Evan. But over the next few weeks, we kept meeting for coffee or walking the trail behind the marsh. Evan asked questions gently, always leaving space for me to answer or stay silent. He never pushed. He remembered everything I said, the names of people in my unit, the way I liked to sit facing the door, the story of how Mama used to tuck my hair behind my ear when I had nightmares. "What about your family?" I asked him once as we sat near the water. He smiled in that sad, fond way that people do when love and loss are entwined. "My folks didn't have much money," he said, "but they had each other, and they raised me to believe kindness isn't something you give to people who earn it. It's something you give because you can." I felt something tighten in my chest. I hadn't grown up with that definition of kindness. My father believed kindness made a person weak. I told Evan as much, and he winced a little. That must have been hard, he said. Not judgmental, not pitying, just honest. I didn't know how much I needed someone to say those words until he said them. The first time Evan came to a family cookout, the air felt thick with tension before we even stepped inside. Mama greeted him warmly, Hannah smiled shyly, but Daddy looked him up and down like a building inspector looking for faults. So, this is the man, he said. Evan extended a hand. Daddy shook it too hard. It wasn't a handshake, it was a test. Evan didn't take the bait. He simply nodded and said, "Thank you for having me." Daddy snorted. "We'll see if you still say that after dinner." That was how it began. During the meal, Daddy asked Evan about his job. Evan answered politely, explaining a project he'd been working on for the county. Daddy leaned back and smirked. "So you draw pictures while real men build things." Evan's expression softened, not hardened. "Well, sir, I design things that keep families safe. That's important to me." For a moment, just a moment, Daddy had no response. His face twitched, his posture stiffened, and I realized something unsettling. My father didn't know what to do with a man who couldn't be intimidated. After the cookout, Evan walked me to my car. He waited until we were alone before speaking. "He's direct," he said carefully. "That's a generous word," I replied. Evan hesitated. "Marion, I don't mind proving myself, but I don't want to fight him. I'm not here to take something from him." I stared at him, struck by his honesty. "He sees you as a threat," I whispered. "He always saw kindness as weakness." Evan shook his head. "Kindness isn't weakness. It's strength people don't know how to measure." His words hit me harder than I wanted them to. For the first time, I realized my father's world and Evan's world were built from different materials. One was forged from control volume and intimidation. The other from steadiness, patience, and respect. I had spent my whole life believing only one could win. But standing beside Evan that night, watching him look at me with quiet certainty, I wondered if maybe I had been wrong. Maybe softness could stand up to steel. Maybe kindness could outlast cruelty. Maybe someone like Evan could love someone like me. And maybe someone like my father sensed all of it long before I did. The ride home from that cookout was one of the quietest drives of my life. Evan kept his hand steady on the wheel eyes fixed on the road that cut through the marshland, but I could feel the tension vibrating under his calm like a low electrical hum. The windows were cracked just enough for the night air to drift in, carrying the scent of pluff mud and salt. Neither of us spoke for nearly 10 minutes. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't awkwardness. It was the kind of silence that sits in the back seat and listens. Evan was the one who broke it first. "Your father doesn't dislike me," he said quietly. "He wants me gone." I turned my face toward the window, watching the faint reflection of my own expression. "I know," I whispered. "He's not subtle," Evan added, though his tone wasn't harsh. If anything, it held compassion for the child I once was. "I don't think he sees me as a threat the way other men might. I think he sees me as a reminder. A reminder of that you're not under his roof anymore." I pressed my lips together and didn't answer, because even though he didn't know my father well, he had already understood too much. When we reached my mother's house, I kissed Evan goodnight in the driveway. He tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, a gesture so tender it made my throat tighten. "Call me if anything happens," he said. "Nothing will I lied," even though the air felt thick and wrong. The moment I stepped inside, I knew he'd been waiting for me. My father stood in the living room, arms folded, posture rigid. The television was off. The lights were dimmed, turning the room into a stage he'd prepared for confrontation. Hannah was nowhere in sight. Mama stayed in the kitchen, pretending to look busy, but even from where I stood, I could see her shoulders tense. "Where have you been?" he asked, as if he hadn't seen me leave with Evan. "At the cookout," I replied, keeping my voice even. He jerked his chin toward the hallway. "I need a word." The hallway felt narrower than I remembered. Childhood photos stared down at me from the walls, each one a reminder of the girl I had been forced to shrink. Daddy stopped beneath the picture of me in my Coast Guard uniform, the one he always criticized quietly, because it proved I had succeeded without him. "You still have time," he said, "to cancel this whole thing." I blinked, stunned by how quickly he cut to the bone. "Dad, the wedding is next week. All the more reason to stop it now," he said. "I'm trying to save you from yourself." I let out a breath that trembled despite my effort to steady it. Save me from what? From a lifetime of picking up after a man who isn't good enough for you. He wasn't raising his voice yet, but the warning signs were all there. The way he leaned forward slightly, the way his jaw clicked, the way he used the word man like it was a title Evan hadn't earned. "Evan is kind," I said. "He's steady. He respects me." My father scoffed. "Soft men hide behind the word respect because they don't know how to lead. He doesn't want to lead me," I said, sharper than I intended. "He wants to love me." Daddy's expression twisted. "Love won't fix stupid." The words hit harder because I'd heard a version of them my whole life. Too emotional, too dramatic, too naive. Now he was aiming those same arrows at Evan. "Dad, you don't know him," I said. "Oh, I know enough," he snapped. "I know he's not strong. I know he's not someone who can protect you. I know he's going to embarrass you." A chill ran through me. The word embarrass. The one he would throw at my husband on our wedding day. I didn't know then what was coming, but my body did. Trauma remembers the future before the mind does. "I'm marrying him," I said firmly. My father leaned in close enough that I smelled the mint gum he always chewed before a lecture. "If you walk down that aisle, don't expect me to clap. Don't expect me to smile. Don't expect me to pretend." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the hallway with memories pressing against my ribs like invisible fingers. That night, I barely slept. I stared at the faded wallpaper of my childhood room, at the little blue stars I'd chosen when I was 10, and felt the weight of the years between then and now pressing down on me. How many moments had I lost because I was too busy navigating his moods? How many decisions had I made to avoid his disappointment rather than pursue my own joy? Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Soft ones. Mama's. I slipped downstairs and found her at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked up as I approached, her expression tired in a way I hadn't fully noticed before. "You're awake," she whispered. "I couldn't sleep." She nodded, staring into her tea as if it held answers. "He talked to you, didn't he?" "Yes." Mama closed her eyes briefly. I tried to stop him. "Why does he hate Evan so much?" I asked. Her face softened into something fragile. "Your father doesn't hate Evan. He hates anything he can't control." My breath caught. Has he always been like this? She swallowed, and for the first time I saw 30 years of silence reflected in her eyes. He listens to no one. Not even himself. He's always been a man who believes he's right, even when he's hurting the people he loves most. Why didn't you leave? The question slipped out before I realized it. Mama looked down at her hands. "Because I thought staying quiet would protect you girls. I thought if I absorbed the worst of him, you wouldn't have to." It felt like something inside me loosened and tightened at the same time, a mix of sorrow, understanding, and anger, not at her, but at the legacy we'd all inherited. "Mom," I whispered, "I'm scared." She reached across the table and took my hand. "Don't let him take your happiness. I lost too many years trying to survive his storms. You're stronger than that." Her voice cracked on the last word, and that was the moment I realized she'd been waiting for me to break a cycle she couldn't. The next morning, the air in the house was thick with unspoken tension. Daddy acted as if nothing had happened, which was always his way after a confrontation. He whistled while he sipped his coffee. He complimented Mama's biscuits. He asked Hannah about school. Not once did he look at me, but he watched me, every movement, every breath, every small sign of rebellion. In the days leading up to the rehearsal dinner, subtle shifts happened that told me the sabotage had already begun. A cousin from Atlanta called to say she heard Evan had been laid off, which wasn't true. An aunt pulled me aside at the grocery store and said she was worried I was rushing into marriage. A neighbor said Daddy had mentioned I wasn't thinking clearly these days. Rumors move fast in small towns, especially when a man like my father whispers them. At first I told myself I was imagining it. But patterns don't lie. And Daddy had been shaping narratives longer than I'd been alive. Evan noticed too. He didn't confront me about it, but one night as we walked along the marsh he said, "Your father is trying to shrink the space around us." I stopped walking. "What does that mean? He wants to isolate you," Evan said. "The less support you feel, the easier it is for him to push you back into place." I'd never heard it phrased that way. It felt like a truth I'd always known but never named. "I'm not going back," I whispered. Evan touched my arm gently. "I know. But he's used to people bending. It's hard for him to understand people who don't." The next Sunday, Daddy sent me a text. "Come alone. We need to talk." Those words made my stomach twist, not because I feared confrontation, but because every time he said "come alone," it meant he had planned something. When I arrived at the house, he was sitting on the porch, hands folded, looking like a man preparing for war. He gestured for me to sit beside him. I didn't. He didn't waste time. "Marrying that boy will ruin your life," he said. "No," I replied. "It will ruin your control." His jaw tightened. "You're emotional. You're not thinking straight. I'm thinking clearer than I ever have." "I'm trying to save you," he insisted. "No," I said again, my voice steady. "You're trying to save your pride." For the first time in my life, I watched my father struggle for words. His mouth closed, then opened again. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual certainty. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. But the strange thing was, the doubt in his voice wasn't about me. It was about him. He dismissed me then, waving me off like he had more important things to do than argue with reality. That night, as I sat on the edge of my bed staring out the window at the swaying Spanish moss, I realized something devastatingly simple. My father wasn't losing control. He was recalibrating it. And the next move he made would change everything. The day before my wedding should have been filled with nothing but small nerves and big joy. I should have been fussing over centerpieces or arguing with Hannah about how tightly to curl my hair, or laughing with Mama as she tried to tie ribbon bows on the chairs. Instead, the house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to crack. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't intuition. It was the simple lived truth that storms always gathered around my father. Relatives had begun arriving early that morning. Suitcases thumped down the hallways. Children ran between rooms. Someone burned a tray of biscuits. My aunt from Tallahassee brought the wrong dress and spent an hour complaining about the humidity. The house should have felt alive. Instead, every sound seemed brittle. Mama floated between the kitchen and dining room, offering drinks, adjusting platters, straightening tablecloths. Hannah sat on the floor in her rehearsal dress, ironing out a stubborn wrinkle with determination that belonged to a much older woman. I moved flowers from one vase to another, trying to ignore the knot twisting itself tight in the center of my chest. For a while, everything appeared normal, until the front door opened with the unmistakable weight of my father's presence. Even among a room full of people, he always entered like someone claiming territory. His boots hit the floor with purpose, loud enough for everyone to pause without realizing why. He stood there for a moment, scanning the room with that searching look he used not to observe but to appraise. "Where's the groom?" he asked, scratching his chin. I didn't answer quickly enough. Or perhaps there was no answer quick enough for him. He waved off the silence and said, "Never mind." "I need to talk to you," jerking his thumb toward the hallway. My stomach tightened. I glanced at Mama. She froze mid-step, her hands gripping a dish towel so tightly it twisted. Hannah stopped moving the iron. A few relatives exchanged nervous glances. Everyone knew the pattern. Daddy didn't pull someone aside for a blessing. He pulled them aside to assert control. I followed him into the narrow hallway lined with family pictures. Birthday parties, Disney World, Christmas mornings with forced smiles. It felt wrong walking past all those frozen memories to face the man who had shaped them more than anyone else. He stopped beneath the framed photo of me holding my Coast Guard graduation certificate. The same picture he never commented on unless it was to say the photographer had overcharged us. He crossed his arms. "You still have time," he said, without preamble. Time for what my voice sounded calmer than I felt. To cancel this wedding. I stared at him, stunned by the certainty in his tone. "Dad, the ceremony is tomorrow." "All the more reason to think clearly," he replied. "I'm telling you this now because I'm trying to save you from yourself." Anger prickled in my veins. Save me from what? From a lifetime with a man who isn't good enough. He said it so plainly as if this were not the same argument we'd been circling for months. As if Evan had committed some unforgivable crime simply by loving me. "He is good enough," I said. "He's good." Daddy's lips twisted. "He's weak. No, you just don't know him." "I know enough," he snapped. "I know he won't challenge you. I know he won't push you to be better. I know he won't protect you. I know he'll embarrass you." There it was again. That word. Embarrass. A word he weaponized like a blade, one he would stab into my husband's heart in front of 100 people the very next day. "You're wrong," I whispered. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so no one in the kitchen could hear. "You're emotional. You don't think straight when you're emotional. If you walk down that aisle tomorrow, don't expect me to clap. Don't expect me to smile. Don't expect me to pretend." He walked away before I could respond. He left me standing alone under the dim hallway light, feeling like that 10-year-old girl kneeling on the floor refolding napkins while he criticized the shape. I didn't cry. I couldn't. Crying felt too familiar, too much like giving him the reaction he expected. Instead, I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my childhood bed, staring at the wallpaper Mama and I had picked out when I was 9. Little blue stars faded now. Funny how things that once felt like magic could turn into reminders of the cages you grew up in. It wasn't long before Hannah slipped into the room, closing the door behind her. "He talked to you," she said softly. "Yeah." She sat beside me, folding her hands in her lap. "He's been pacing all morning. Mom tried to get him to run an errand, but he wouldn't leave. He's gearing up for something." "I know," I said. She looked at me with worry drawn across her face. "Are you okay?" "No," I said honestly, "but I'm getting married tomorrow." And that's the part he can't stop. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The house was quiet, filled with the faint hum of distant conversation and the occasional clatter of a dish being washed. I wandered downstairs in my socks, drawn to the faint glow of a lamp in the kitchen. Mama sat at the table again, just like she had on so many nights before when storms brewed. She had her tea, though it was untouched. Her eyes looked tired, lined with years of choosing peace over confrontation. "You're awake," she whispered. "Couldn't sleep." She nodded as if she'd expected that. "He talked to you again." "Yes," I said, "and I don't understand why he wants to ruin this for me." Mama exhaled long and slow, like she'd been holding something inside far too long. "Your father doesn't know how to let go," she said. "He thinks control is love. He thinks criticism is guidance. He thinks fear is protection." She paused. "He has always been this way." But why? My voice cracked. Why can't he just be happy for me? Her eyes softened. "Because if you choose a man who treats you better than he treats me, he'll have to admit he failed." The truth hit me like a tidal wave. Mama had never said anything like that out loud. For 30 years, she had softened his edges, smoothed his roughness, explained away his temper. Hearing her speak plainly felt like a part of her had finally stepped out of the shadows. "He'll never admit it," she added. "And you?" I asked. "What about you, Mom? Don't you want better too?" She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had wiped my tears, packed my lunches, held her marriage together with invisible thread. "I wanted peace," she said. "And I thought silence was the price." "But it isn't," I whispered. No, she said. It isn't. We sat there together, the weight of her confession settling into the cracks between us. For the first time, I saw her not as the quiet woman who bent herself around my father's storms, but as someone who had given up pieces of herself to protect her daughters. I don't want to live like that, I said. I know, she replied, and I'm proud of you for choosing differently. The next morning, the rehearsal should have brought joy. I should have been surrounded by laughter and excitement, but the tension followed my father like a shadow. Every room he walked into fell quiet. Every conversation paused. Relatives glanced back and forth between him and Evan like spectators waiting for a collision. Evan tried to stay polite, but Daddy's eyes tracked his every move, searching for failures. When Evan held the door open for Mama, Daddy muttered, overcompensating. When Evan complimented the decorations, Daddy said, people who talk too much are usually hiding something. At one point, Evan straightened a centerpiece that had tilted slightly on a table. Daddy smirked and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Told you he was soft." The insult cut through the air like a blade. Evan didn't respond, but his jaw tightened. Mama shot Daddy a warning look, which he ignored. Hannah's face flushed in embarrassment. I walked over to Evan, touching his arm lightly. "Are you okay?" He nodded, though the exhaustion in his eyes said otherwise. "Your dad doesn't need a reason," he said quietly. "He just needs an audience." The rehearsal ended early because no one could pretend the atmosphere was normal. People hugged me with tight, uncertain smiles. Cousins whispered apologies into my hair. A few relatives avoided me entirely, choosing instead to orbit around my father like planets, afraid to drift too far from the sun. When we got home that evening, Daddy slammed doors harder than usual. Mama stayed out of his way. Hannah retreated to her room. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty fireplace, fighting the urge to run from the house and never return. Evan called me later that night. His voice was calm, steady, exactly what I needed. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Your father doesn't get to decide your life." I know, I whispered, though my chest felt tight. "But he's going to try. Then we'll face him together." I closed my eyes. The fear was still there, crouched in the corners of my mind, whispering doubts I had learned long ago. But Evan's words were an anchor I didn't know I needed. The day before my wedding, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Daddy pacing down the hall. Each footstep sounded like a countdown. I didn't know what he was planning, but I knew this: whatever he did tomorrow would not be an accident. It would not be a slip of the tongue. It would be deliberate. And it would be cruel. I just didn't know yet how public his cruelty would become. The rehearsal dinner should have been the warm-up to the happiest day of my life, but instead it felt like walking into a room where the furniture had been subtly rearranged. Nothing looked wrong at first glance, yet nothing felt safe. It was held at a small restaurant on the edge of town, a place with wooden beams across the ceiling, and soft lighting that usually made people feel comfortable. Not that night. Not with the storm gathering in my father's eyes. Evan and I arrived early to greet guests, standing side by side as people walked in with bright smiles and wrapped boxes and well wishes. I clung to those moments, those tiny pockets of normalcy. Hannah fixed a strand of my hair, whispering, "You look beautiful," and Mama hugged me longer than usual, her arms gentle but trembling. Daddy arrived last, walking through the door like he owned the place. He scanned the room the way a general scans a battlefield. His eyes landed on Evan and tightened, as if Evan's very existence offended him. I watched him greet relatives, shaking hands firmly, clapping shoulders, laughing loudly, in a way that felt performative and hollow. We sat down for dinner, everyone shuffling into their seats with polite conversation. Evan sat next to me. Daddy sat directly across the table, close enough that I could feel the weight of his disapproval with every bite of food I took. I tried to ignore him. I tried to focus on the warm roll in my hand, on Hannah telling a story about college, on Mama smiling through her nerves. But tension has a way of sticking to the walls, amplifying every sound. The clink of forks, the scrape of a chair, the uneven breaths of a room trying too hard. When dessert arrived, Daddy leaned back in his chair, stretching like a man preparing for a performance. He tapped his spoon against the water glass, and the sound echoed through the restaurant until every conversation stopped. My stomach turned. Not again, I thought. Not tonight. I just want to say a few words, he said, his voice carrying easily. Evan stiffened beside me. Mama's hand froze on her napkin. Hannah dropped her fork. I opened my mouth to stop him, but he spoke first. Tomorrow, Daddy said my little girl's getting married. The way he emphasized little girl made my teeth clench. He paused for dramatic effect, scanning the room like a comedian timing his punchline. And I know some of you think she's making a fine choice, but I for one think she's rushing into something she doesn't understand. Several guests shifted in their seats. An aunt coughed quietly. I felt my pulse begin to pound. Now don't get me wrong, Daddy continued. Evan here seems like a decent enough fellow. He's polite, quiet, soft-spoken. But is that what a woman needs? Evan inhaled sharply. My fingers tightened around his. Daddy wasn't done. A woman needs a man who's strong. He said, his eyes locking onto Evan like a hawk sizing up a mouse. A man who can protect her, provide for her, challenge her. And I'm not convinced this one has what it takes. My vision blurred. Heat surged up my neck. The room went uncomfortably still. I could feel the collective shock of our guests, the disbelief that he would say something so cruel so publicly. But of course he would. Cruelty was his native language. I leaned forward. Dad, that's enough. But he ignored me. I'm not trying to be the bad guy, he went on, spreading his hands in a mock gesture of innocence. I'm just telling the truth. And the truth is I expected more for my daughter. The knife landed there, swift, precise, public. A few guests looked down at their plates. Mama's lips parted like she wanted to interrupt but didn't know how. Hannah quietly whispered, "Stop, Dad." But he brushed her off with a shake of his head. Evan swallowed hard, his jaw tightened. His eyes didn't lower, didn't retreat. But the hurt was unmistakable, etched into the lines around his mouth, sinking into the place where pride and pain intersect. Daddy leaned back in his chair, satisfied, as if he'd done everyone a service by announcing his disapproval. I stood so quickly my chair screeched across the floor. Gasps rippled around the room. Daddy's eyes met mine with mild amusement, which told me he believed I would back down. But something inside me snapped, not suddenly, not violently. It was quieter than that, like a thread pulled too tight for too long finally giving way. "We're done here," I said. Daddy blinked. "What, you have crossed every line you could cross?" I said, my voice steady but shaking from the inside. "And I will not let you keep doing this." Evan stood with me, placing a gentle hand on my back. Mama covered her mouth with both hands. Hannah's eyes filled not with fear, but something like relief. My father stared at me, baffled that I dared to oppose him in front of an audience. His pride cracked for the first time. "You can walk out," he said, "but it won't change the truth. I'm not interested in your version of the truth," I said. "Not anymore." I walked away from the table and headed toward the exit, Evan matching my steps, Hannah rushing behind us. Mama hesitated, torn between the man she shared a life with and the daughter she'd finally learned to stand beside. Behind me, Daddy called out, "You'll regret this, Marion." I didn't turn around. Outside, the night air felt sharp, cool against my burning skin. The parking lot lights glowed like moons suspended above us. Evan took my hand, but I pulled him into a hug instead, burying my face in his chest. His arms wrapped around me with steady, grounding warmth. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "For what?" he asked softly. "You didn't hurt me." He did. I should have stopped him sooner. "You can't stop a man like that," he murmured. "But you stood up to him. That matters." Hannah reached us, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know you were going to do that," she said. "Marion, I've wanted you to for years." Mama stepped outside next. She looked smaller than usual, weighed down by decades of choosing quiet over confrontation. But when she reached me, she touched my arm gently. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't do it first." Those words nearly broke me. We drove home separately, needing space but also needing each other. Evan's truck followed behind my car like a guardian. When we arrived at Mama's house, Daddy wasn't there. The lights were on. The living room was empty. A beer bottle sat half-finished on the coffee table. The front door was left ajar. Mama sighed, looking exhausted. "He'll come back when he's ready," she said. "He always does." The three of us moved into the living room, too wired to sleep, too drained to talk much. Hannah curled up on the sofa, hugging a pillow. Mama made tea again, hands trembling slightly as she poured the water. Evan sat beside me on the floor, resting his back against the couch. I kept hearing my father's voice, that mocking tone, that confidence, that rejection disguised as concern. Every word looped in my mind like a poisonous mantra. Evan touched my knee. "Look at me." I did. "You're not wrong for loving me," he said, "and you're not wrong for demanding respect." His words steadied me like a hand on a trembling compass. "I'm scared," I admitted. "Of him?" Evan asked. "Of tomorrow," I said. "Of what he'll do, what he'll say, who he'll hurt." Evan nodded slowly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." He meant it. I felt it in his voice, in the warmth of his hand, in the quiet conviction that had drawn me to him in the first place. I leaned into him, letting the tension melt from my shoulders. Eventually, Mama spoke. "Marion," she said softly, "your father has lived his whole life believing he knows best. When he's challenged, he lashes out. When he feels powerless, he tries to regain control. But tomorrow isn't about him, it's about you and the man you choose. And he can't destroy that unless you let him." Hannah added, her voice steadier now. I closed my eyes, listening to the women who had survived the same storms I did. I thought of every moment my father had tried to undercut my confidence, every time he made me question my own strength. And I thought of every moment Evan had built me back up. The contrast was blinding. Long after everyone went to bed, I remained awake on the sofa, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant chirping of crickets outside. The house was too quiet, too fragile. And as I sat there in the dim glow of the lamp, one thought kept circling my mind. If tonight was the rehearsal for heartbreak, then tomorrow would be its main performance. But I didn't know yet how loudly he would strike, or how loudly I would answer. On the morning of my wedding, the world felt too still. The sunlight filtering through the curtains looked soft and warm, but it carried no comfort. It was the kind of light that exposes more than it soothes. I woke up before my alarm, lying there in the quiet, waiting for the weight in my chest to loosen. It didn't. It only deepened. I sat up slowly, letting my feet touch the wooden floor. The house was unusually silent. Not peaceful silent, but hollow silent, like the air had been emptied out during the night. For a moment I let myself imagine a different world, one where my father had been the kind of man who kissed his daughter's forehead and said he couldn't wait to walk her down the aisle, one where his pride came from my happiness, not his control. But reality has sharp edges, and it always returns. When I walked downstairs, Mama was already pacing the kitchen. Her hair was half pinned, half loose, as if she'd tried to get ready but could only manage the motions. She gave me a small, brave smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Morning, sweetheart," she said. "Morning." She poured me a cup of coffee, though her hands shook slightly. "You should eat something." I wasn't hungry, but I nodded. She buttered a biscuit that I only tore apart, leaving the pieces scattered across my plate. Hannah slipped into the kitchen wearing a robe, rubbing her eyes. "You okay?" she whispered. I nodded, though the answer was complicated. I was excited to marry Evan. I was terrified of what my father would do. I was exhausted from carrying fear that wasn't mine to hold anymore. And somewhere beneath everything, a quiet fire was starting to build. A fire that would not stay contained for much longer. Daddy entered the kitchen around 7. He didn't say hello. He didn't acknowledge the tension he'd caused at the rehearsal dinner. He simply opened the fridge, took out a bottle of orange juice, drank straight from it, and said, "We're leaving in an hour." Mama's jaw clenched. Hannah looked away. I sat very still. He didn't look at me when he spoke. It was as if I were furniture taking up space. A lamp, a chair, something that existed but didn't require acknowledgement. He had mastered the art of withholding affection in a way that could wound more deeply than words. The hour that followed was a blur of curling irons, makeup brushes, and whispered conversations. Mama tried to help me with my dress, but her hands fumbled. Hannah stepped in, smoothing the fabric, fastening the buttons down my spine. She paused at the last one, leaning her forehead against my shoulder. "He can't ruin this," she whispered. I wanted to believe her. The drive to the venue took 20 minutes. Daddy insisted on driving me and Mama in his truck, leaving Hannah to follow behind. I sat in the back seat, my dress draped across my lap, staring at the back of his head. He didn't speak. He didn't turn around. Mama occasionally glanced at me in the rearview mirror, offering quiet reassurance in the form of soft smiles. When we pulled up to the event center, my heart fluttered. It wasn't extravagant, but it was warm and beautiful in its own way. White lights were strung along the entrance. Volunteers bustled inside. The faint scent of gardenias drifted through the air. If you ignored the tension coiling inside my chest, it almost felt like the morning of a joyful beginning. Inside the bridal suite, the makeup artist brushed a soft color along my cheeks, while photographers snapped candid pictures. People kept saying how radiant I looked, how lucky Evan was, how today would be unforgettable. Unforgettable. Yes. They had no idea how true that would be. The ceremony itself was simple and lovely. Evan stood at the altar looking both nervous and overwhelmingly sure. When Mama walked me halfway down the aisle and stepped aside so I could walk the rest alone, tears welled in her eyes. Daddy refused to participate, claiming tradition had been watered down enough. I didn't ask him again. Evan's expression when he saw me made the whole room fade. He whispered, "You look like the rest of my life." My breath caught in my throat. This was the moment I chose him. Not because I needed saving, but because with him I never had to shrink. The vows were beautiful. My hands shook as I slipped the ring onto his finger. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, cheers erupted from the guests. Evan kissed me softly, reverently, like he understood exactly how much had been risked for this moment. And for a little while, long enough to take photos, long enough to eat half a plate of food, long enough to believe the storm might pass, it felt peaceful. It felt safe. It felt like we'd made it through. Until my father grabbed the microphone. I didn't even see him walk up to the DJ table. One moment, Evan was laughing with our friends, the next, the speakers crackled, and Daddy's voice filled the banquet hall. "Everyone listen up," he said, tapping the mic twice. "I want to say a few words about the groom." The clinking of glasses stopped. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. A cold shiver ran through the room. Mama's hand flew to her chest. Hannah whispered, "Oh, God." I felt the blood drain from my face. Daddy stood in the center of the dance floor, microphone in hand posture, loose and confident. He wasn't drunk. That would have been easier to explain. No, he was sober, purposeful, dangerous. "This boy," he said, pointing straight at Evan, "is an idiot. But my daughter insisted on marrying him anyway." Laughter, uneven, nervous, startled. People laughed because they thought he was joking, because it was easier than believing the father of the bride would intentionally humiliate the groom. But laughter is cruel when it is born from confusion. I heard it echo like a slap. Evan's face paled. His fingers tightened around his napkin. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, trying to maintain dignity that my father had already shattered. And me? My legs began to shake. Daddy shrugged theatrically. "Kids these days don't listen to their parents. So what can you do?" More laughter. He absorbed it like applause. Mama sat frozen, her face draining of color. Hannah covered her mouth. The DJ fidgeted, unsure if he should intervene. Relatives exchanged horrified glances. I felt something rise inside me, something ancient, something that had been silenced for years. It wasn't rage, not pure rage. It was clarity. A clarity that came from 30 years of being shaped, corrected, minimized, dismissed. A clarity that bloomed from the wounds he never apologized for. A clarity sharp enough to